Thank you so much for joining us. My name is David Leslie. I'm a professor of ethics, technology, and society here at Queen Mary University of London in the Digital Environment Research Institute. I'm also the director of ethics and responsible innovation research at the Alan Turing Institute. So you're joining us for the promise of AI working across disciplines for the public good. And to kick us off today, before I introduce our speakers, we have Lord Tim Clement-Jones from the House of Lords, who's also an esteemed author of the recently published book, Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, AI Policy and Governance for the Future. And Tim will lead us into our broader conversation, framing some of the thoughts that we'll explore through this kind of governance lens. Go ahead, Tim.
David, thank you very much. And it's a huge pleasure to be able to contribute to today's event. And I'm only sorry that I can't be with you all. Academics and researchers are all used to writing about their chosen subject and backing it up with scientific and other evidence. Politicians, less so. As David says, I've recently published a book on AI regulation and policy. And I've spent the last 8 years thinking mainly about the implications of AI in all its forms. And I thought it was high time to put a few thoughts in writing, especially about the opportunities and risks and the potential impact of AI. Now, I've had enough of expecting anyone to read my speeches in Hansard or listen to the occasional podcast. So that's really why I burst into print. I'm an optimist about the future of AI and its uses. Only today, for instance, there was a piece in the Times about how AI is helping identify new treatments for Parkinson's disease, which has so far resisted human researchers. I could give any number of other positive examples in healthcare. After all, we have our own Queen Mary Precision Healthcare University Research Institute, which is at the leading edge of this, and the same is true in a whole range of other research fields which are represented in our Digital Environment Research Institute and across the university. And of course, there are other really important aspects and outcomes of AI, potentially in terms of delivery of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But it's such a powerful transformation technology that the question isn't whether we can use it for a particular purpose, but whether we should. Innovation may be positive, but not always. And that means we need regulation to help us decide. How and whether we regulate is central to the AI master or servant question, which I raise in my book. And the question for many of us is what I describe as the legislation business, is how best to apply regulation and law in a way which will ensure that ethical values apply to the development and adoption of AI systems. In certain fields, such as health, there is a clear ethical framework which is followed for research, development and application of AI technology. But that's not necessarily the case across the board in other sectors. And this has been exacerbated by the advent of generative AI and concerns about the impact of dis and misinformation and the use of things like deep fakes on social media and during election time. Different jurisdictions are adopting different approaches. The risk-based EU AI Act has now been agreed and will come into effect in early 2026. The US federal government is adopting some comprehensive guidelines for the use and transparency of AI in government. The UK, by contrast, is not regulating developers and private sector adopters, but plans to introduce an algorithmic recording transparency standard across government, which will give limited visibility to AI use in the public sector. Now, the different approaches to regulation is what the book tries to discuss, along with the question of how we stop a few big tech developers from becoming all-powerful and how we equip our citizens for the age of AI. The crucial question is how to ensure that despite differing regulatory regimes, ethical researchers and developers are able internationally to collaborate and commercialize their innovations on a global basis, and consumers and adopters can have the necessary confidence. The answer, in my view, lies in international agreement on common standards, such as those of risk and impact assessment, testing, audit, ethical design for AI systems, and consumer assurance, which incorporate internationally accepted AI ethics. This would provide the certainty that researchers, developers, and businesses need to develop and invest in the UK more readily, irrespective of the level of obligation to adopt them in different jurisdictions and deliver the necessary public trust. So this is already happening in a number of international fora like UNESCO and the OECD, and that's what makes me an optimist, which means I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's sessions to hear about the positive aspects of what our university is doing in using AI in research.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim. And it's really nice to hear that the thinking now is about how do we advance this technology moving forward. The purpose of our conversation today is to talk about the promises, but I think also potentially the perils of the moment that we're in at this inflection point, we might say, where AI can really contribute to advancing research. So just to say, we are amidst a transition point in the use of AI in research. Over the past decade or so, it's increasingly acknowledged that one can, with scaling data and scaling compute, apply very complex deep learning models to data to approximate veritably any computable function. And this is just opening up a huge terrain of possibility to model climate change, to model the human body and improve health, to model a natural language. And so we're at a point now where the potential impacts of using artificial intelligence in research could be a real force multiplier for progress. That being said, the scaling of data, the scaling of model complexity, and the scaling of compute present all sorts of different challenges that we really do need also to pay attention to. For instance, the scaling of data, the data needed to sort of build very large, complex models, means that data sets can become unfathomable. We've got issues of what's called data leakage or memorization that can lead to privacy violations. We've got issues of potential data protection violation for generative AI systems, issues of intellectual property violation as well. With the scaling of data, in addition, we have to worry, for instance, about discriminatory patterns which might be baked into or buried within these extremely large data sets. As we think of scaling model complexity, issues of interpretability are raised. How can we use models in research that may be unpredictable, that we don't necessarily understand the inner logic or rationale behind the outputs of the system? And this is raising some real concerns that we need to also confront. And scaling compute. Scaling compute means greater environmental costs. It also means a greater footprint in building hardware to compute, to process information. And so we have a set of potential issues there as well. So all that to say, we do need to sort of rock back and forth between being very aware that AI can be a force multiplier to advance research, but also being very diligent about ensuring responsible innovation in the way that we're using AI in research. So we have two absolutely brilliant researchers from Queen Mary here today to talk to us on very different dimensions of research that's being done in algorithmic systems and AI at Queen Mary. Our first speaker is Julia Ive. Julia is a lecturer in natural language processing at the School of Electronic Engineering and Computer Science. Her main research focus is NLP, natural language processing, the field of science that enables machines to analyze and synthesize everyday text and speech or what we would call natural languages. Her work combines three main areas of scientific expertise: computer science, linguistics, and cognitive science. And her main research focus is on the generation of natural language. She designs optimal ways to generate human language using machines. Currently, she's working on the theoretical aspects of style preservation and privacy safety in artificial context generation. Julia was previously a research fellow at Imperial College London's Language and Multimodal AI Lab. Our second speaker is Isadora Cruxen. Isadora is a lecturer in business and society at Queen Mary. She studies the political economy of development with a focus on Latin America and Brazil. She co-leads the collaborative action research project called Data Against Feminicide, which aims to understand data activism about feminicide and gender-related violence across the Americas. The team works with activists to co-design technological tools using algorithmic technologies that support their work. Isadora also looks at how AI is designed and how to build digital technologies through participatory processes, through design justice that engages communities, values their lived experiences, and confronts structural inequalities. She holds a PhD in political economy, development, and planning from MIT, and also a master's in city planning that is also from MIT. So I will turn it now over to Julia as our first speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. It's my biggest pleasure to be able to present my work here today. And I will talk about AI in general, what is it, and some interdisciplinary uses of AI in my work. So first, what is AI? AI systems, they analyze in an intelligent way, in human-like way, problems and take actions to achieve their goal with certain deal of autonomy. So AI, as you can see on my slide, is a vast field, and in the core of it we have machine learning. You might have heard about it, and then in the core of machine learning we have, again, very famous deep learning. And at periphery, intersecting with AI, we have natural language processing. Where I work in, we have robotics, we have computer vision. These are interdisciplinary fields. So for example, natural language processing, it also intersects with computational linguistics, with social sciences, with cognitive sciences. And natural language processing is automatic processing of natural language for a task. We're talking again about tasks here. AI performs tasks for us. And usually in the input to a natural language processing model, we have some text. You can see here, this is another domain of my research, of application of AI for me, is mental health text. So when it goes into an NLP model, we typically have two types of inputs. So the first could be generation. So that could be a summary, for example, of this text for a clinician, or this could be also result of an analysis of this text. For example, it could be prediction of early dementia with 20% chance. So why do we actually even have natural language processing? Because this processing of natural language is very hard for the machines. So looking at the healthcare text, I can try to illustrate those challenges of natural language for automatic processing. So first and foremost, we have ambiguity. So different words, they have different meaning in different contexts, right? So we have, for example, to some degree and finishing her degree. This is the same word. It has different meanings in those two sentences. Then we have difficulties to analyze the structure of sentences, right? So we need to find what we are talking about, who we are talking about in this sentence. We have a lot of expressive means and language around uncertainty. Negation could be expressed in various different ways in sentences as well. And then in medical text, we have also abbreviations, acronyms, and different complex relationship between different diagnostic events and timelines. And although, thanks to the advancements of large language models recently, we have managed to have a big success in addressing those challenges. And large language models, they train billions and trillions of parameters using the data usually coming from internet, and they actually train to produce word probabilities. And they can be used for many multiple different tasks at the same time. And probably one of the most famous models you all know about large language model is ChatGPT. So it is a model based on generative pre-trained transformer model. So this is a deep learning model. I give a diagram of this model here. It's a very complex deep learning. There are a lot of layers in this model, and each of these layers apply different mathematical operations. So transformers are very good in analyzing patterns, linguistic patterns in language. So what they do, they take the previous sequence, generated text or whatever text you give to this model into account, analyze it, and generate new text word by word. So that's essentially how it is happening, right? So we generate our text word by word until we get the whole text again. And as I said, this large language model, they are extremely good in analyzing textual patterns. But what they do not know, they do not get too much into the social context, into the actual context of interaction. And that's where our natural language processing research is going currently in, is to understand how these models will be embedded and integrated into the social immediate context of interaction, and furthermore into the social context as the society as a whole, how will they fit in and help with the tasks. So that comes to the point of my presentation, where I would like to talk about some of my research and actually how I use AI and those large language models in interdisciplinary contexts, so that both AI and natural language processing, they benefit, and other disciplines, they benefit from each other to advance science. So the first aspect that I would like to talk about is text privacy. So in my slide, in my example, to the left, I have actually an electronic health record which has been de-identified, meaning that the direct identifiers such as name or ID number of a patient, they have been stripped off, deleted from the record. But we have a lot of other information. This is a text. And the key point I would like to emphasize here is that any combination of textual chunks can identify an individual. So in this example, even if directly we don't have the name, we don't have the ID, we have a lot of other interesting facts about this person, such, for example, a rare diagnosis, narcolepsy. We have some very rather precise indication towards a university, and we have also a publicized fact, a prize in physics. And actually, the unique combination of these three facts that could be found in this electronic health record could actually relate this record on the semantic level. There is no direct match, but these large language models, again, they're very good now in analyzing notions and concepts behind. It could be matched to the social media account of this person, and eventually the person could be re-identified. And that's where the large language models are helping me and help other research in privacy to understand more, to embrace the concept of privacy, to embrace the concept of sensitive information, and also help the privacy protection, for example, by rewriting certain parts of text so that such unique combination of elements could not be met. So this aspect of textual privacy comes particularly important happened in the context of the proliferation of the chatbot conversation and usage, and usage of chatbots more and more often, especially in mental health, especially for mental health support, where people are actually giving away very sensitive information, and has been shown in recent research a lot that this natural flow of conversation, it promotes self-disclosure. So just to give you a very brief example, this example is motivated by our own research in the team, is that, for example, when you ask people a very direct question, what degree did you receive, in a questionnaire, right? So they fill out the questionnaire. The answer is rather direct, master in something, in computer science. But when you ask the same question during a chatbot conversation, people tend to chat more, to disclose more information, talk about more about university, talking about more about the things that they are moving on forward. That you can now kind of see which kind of sensitive information could come out of this. And the last probably aspect of my research, very interdisciplinary again, I would like to talk about is the problem of bias. And I would like to talk about the problem of bias in mental health nodes. So just to give a very brief introduction here. So mental health nodes, they're not just common healthcare nodes. These are nodes that contain a lot of additional information on the demographics of people, on their social interactions, on how they live. So this is not only diagnostics purely treatment. There is always something more, which is extremely important for the healthcare diagnosis. And in our group, we work with detecting pediatric anxiety. So these are the children from 5 to 8, and we have received data, and we have built our AI models for this data. And what we discovered is that even with a very careful choice of cohorts, matching by age, matching by gender, females, they get constantly more false negatives than males. And we started to look closer into the data, and we understood that there are disparities in qualitative descriptions of the diagnostics for females and the diagnostics for males. And you can actually see at the left of my slides, this is a very, probably a very much AI diagram, but essentially what it tells us is that we have those groups of words, right? So they form topics together. And the more we have blue color, the more intense is it. It means the more topic is represented. And you can see that there are differences in those representations of topics for males and for females. There are differences. So this conclusion, essentially derived from the AI models, helped us to look closer into the data, to look closer into the diagnostic procedure, to inform our clinicians in the interdisciplinary team what could be done about the diagnostic procedure. So I believe that it's very close for me time to finish my presentation, and I thank you a lot for your attention, and also my team who are working with me on this research topic at Queen Mary University. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julia. And now, Isadora, would you?
Yes, thank you. Just checking whether the slides are working.
Good.
Yes, they're there. Excellent. So thank you, David, and thank you, Julia. Thank you as well to everyone who's joining us online, and to the team from Queen Mary that worked really hard to put this together. You can't see them, but they're here, so thank you very much. The project that I'll talk about today is a large collaborative research project, as David previewed, that's called Data Against Feminicide. This project emerged from a collaboration between Catherine D'Ignazio at MIT, Elena Suarez-Val, who leads Feminicide Uruguay, and Silvana Fumega, who at the time was at the Open Data, Latin American Open Data Initiative. And I started working on it 4 years ago, almost 5, as a graduate student, and I now co-lead this project with them. The first thing I want to note is that this is not a project about AI. And the motivation to work on this project did not emerge from an idea of wanting to develop AI technology or AI-based platforms. But the reason we started working with AI is because we wanted to work with activists who monitor and produce data about gender-related violence, and specifically about feminicide across very diverse contexts. So how I thought I would structure this presentation is to really provide context a bit on the project first, and on the problem of feminicide. Then talk about the principles that inform what we do and how we work with activists, and then how that led to the development of a machine learning classifier that is built into a digital tool that we co-designed and developed with activists to support their work. Like I said, this project is fundamentally concerned with supporting forms of data activism against feminicide. And feminicide is the gender-related killing of both cis and transgender women. It's a structural and systemic problem that has intersectional roots and intersectional manifestations. We know that this is a global challenge. Just to provide a statistic, in 2022, UN Women estimated that around 89,000 women were intentionally killed. Women and girls were intentionally killed, and that was the highest number on record for the last 20 years. But we also know that these statistics tend to be misleading and underreport or underestimate the problem, right? That's due to underreporting, incomplete or inaccurate data. Often official data is lacking or missing important information in some important way, which we refer to in our project as missing data. And a lot of activists and grassroots groups and civil society organizations have sort of tried to respond to some of these challenges by collecting data of their own, right? And this is what we call counter data collection in our work. And I should note that these activists are not just collecting data or producing data to create more numbers or more statistics. They produce data for various reasons, including to support political mobilization and collective action, to hold institutions to account, especially state institutions, and to memorialize and remember the lives of women and girls that have been killed. So in relation to this context, what we do in our project, I would say the project has three overarching aims. The first is to understand the monitoring practices and technological challenges that activists face across diverse contexts. The second is to help build a community of practice around feminicide data activism. And the third is to co-design and develop digital tools that can support or facilitate, but not replace, this labor of feminicide data production, which is both time-intensive and very emotionally draining. So methodologically, this has various steps and very kind of varying moving parts. In the last 4 to 5 years, we've interviewed more than 40 organizations, which you can see illustrated in the map, that have done or still do work to monitor feminicides in their contexts. And we've worked with several of these organizations to also develop digital tools, one of which I'll talk about in a second. First, I just want to say a couple things. One is that, as you can see, most of our work has been across the Americas, and that's because of histories of activism and research experience within our broader team. And the second thing I want to note before I talk about one of the tools we have development is that this work is really grounded in principles from data feminism. Data feminism comes from the book of the same name that was written by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein. And the principles encompass several aspects, but I want to highlight, for example, understanding that our world and the data that we produce about it are shaped by structural inequalities and power asymmetries, and also the importance of embracing pluralism and collaboration as ways of centering diverse lived experiences and contexts, and ensuring that from the outset, the approach that we take to research and design take plural perspectives into account. So that is reflected in the participatory approach that we take in this project. So to illustrate, one of the tools that have emerged from these collaborations, I'll focus on an email alerts platform that we have developed, which revolves around a machine learning classifier. So what was the problem that we were trying to address with this tool? Basically, based on our qualitative research and on co-design sessions with activists, We identified that many activists use news articles to monitor feminicides across various locations, but that meant that they also had to read through a lot of violent content, and violent content that wasn't necessarily related to feminicide. Right, so we wanted to find a way to try to minimize the labor and the emotional toll that could take on the activists. So through collaboration, we built a tailored email alerts platform that is based on this machine learning classifier, which identifies news articles that are highly likely to concern a feminicide, compiles these, and then sends them to the activists as emails, but also is organized within a platform that the activists can access. You can see an example on the slide. So I'll just try to briefly explain how this works. So first, we worked with activists to label a data set of news articles that were extracted from a database from Media Cloud. So Media Cloud is an open source media platform that is a partner in our project. And the idea was to collaborate with activists in labeling these news articles as this relate to feminicide, this do not relate to feminicide, to sort of simplify. And be able to train the model in a way that you would, based on the understandings of feminicide, and that ground the everyday monitoring that the activists already do, right? So we did this process, this collaborative data annotation process in English and Spanish first, and then we recently did the same for Portuguese, and the Portuguese version came out last year. So at every step, I wanted to highlight this, at every step from conception to data set annotation to model development to the testing of the tools, we sought to engage the activists in the process and to make sure that the system worked for them, right? I think that's like a really important part of this conversation and how we think about AI for more progressive goals. Just to maybe say a little bit more about how the email alert system work. In essence, like Media Cloud, our partner, has a vast media database that's organized around different geographic catalogs, and that is updated every day. So when an activist creates a project in our platform, they define a geography that has an associated media catalog, and they also specify some queries and keywords to search through these news articles. So then the system runs these queries against the Media Cloud collection, and the results are then filtered through the machine learning classifier that will then return articles that are more likely to refer to a feminicide based on the probability threshold that we set, and that probability is often set at 75%. Just to segue into my conclusion, I want to say that the development of the system was really iterative. It's taken a lot of reflection, a lot of learning, a lot of time, and a lot of work to make it useful for the activists. And I think this leads to my two concluding points. One of them is that the work does not stop at building these tools. So we do a lot of work to remain engaged with the activists and in communication with them to make sure that the tools are working, to fix problems that inevitably arrive because those models are not perfect in any way. And second, we continuously seek to build community and create spaces for knowledge sharing and for solidarity building amongst the broader community of data activists and others who are engaged in gender-related violence and feminicide monitoring. So this is done via workshops, events, and various kinds of written work, which are shown here, and includes co-writing with the activists that collaborate on the project. And then finally, the second thing I wanted to say to conclude is that this is truly a collective effort in the same way that Julia highlighted in her project. Involves a really interdisciplinary team that cuts across design, urban planning, computer science, media studies, political science, international relations, development studies. And I think the fact that we can bring together these different skill sets, different knowledge bases is really important for being able to build technologies and think about them in a way that's really inclusive and that takes social justice seriously. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me just point out for those dialing in from home. So if you look at the Q&A function and want to share a question or two with us, please enter those in, and they'll be conveyed to us on the stage here. But in advance of that, maybe I'll just start us off with a question. So, and maybe I'll direct it to Isadora, because in your talk, you mentioned these dynamics of systemic inequality, structural injustice, power asymmetry. Now, these sort of, I don't know, ecosystem level patterns, they can find their way into research, right? They can determine who gets to access AI, right, in research, or who's able to use, and use and take advantage of the technologies in their research. It can actually seep into the data that's driving AI and AI research, and it can find its way into the actual design of the systems. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how we might sort of take an interdisciplinary perspective to start addressing that really difficult set of challenges.
Yeah, thank you. I think, doing that and addressing the challenges that you just posed starts with an awareness of precisely that, right? That the systems embed and reproduce structural inequalities, and that they find their way into the process and the design as well. I think there are various ways to kind of think about this. I think there's been a lot of movement, for example, around improving dataset documentation, transparency, accountability. There are efforts to do dataset auditing, and also try to anticipate ethical issues, biases, and so forth. I think in our work from a process standpoint, what we try to think about is starting with that motivation that I spoke about of examining power and challenging power from the beginning. Try to think about how can we engage the relevant communities throughout design, development, deployment, and so forth. And like you just previewed, even when you do that, there are biases that will still trickle in or become apparent in this process. So to illustrate, the very first system, the very first model that we built was kind of far from ideal if we think about it from an intersectional lens, a feminist lens. So the model worked really well for activists and groups that were monitoring feminicide broadly across, large geographies in a way. So, for example, in Brazil or United States, but worked much less well for groups that were focused on more specific forms of violence, especially intersectional violence. So, for example, Black women killed by police or murdered Indigenous women and girls. So there are various reasons for them, but one of them is just that the source data that we're working with, which is news media, tends to underreport or misreport on a lot of these cases in ways that makes it hard to identify, cases that might relate to these particular communities. So what we did to try to kind of make sure that the system would work perhaps just as well as it did for some of the other groups was a more targeted effort to develop a model that would take this specific context into account. We've written a paper on this that was led by Hareen Suresh, and I'm happy to share with the broader audience if they're interested. But essentially the point is that it takes iteration, it takes dialogue, it takes awareness, and it takes intention, right, to constantly be thinking about where are the flaws, where are the biases, and how can we try to build the systems in a way that engage diverse communities and work for diverse communities and not just for a majority or for an average.
Now, Julie, you're in the trenches of this as well. I mean, you mentioned this research on bias in the mental health context. I'm wondering what your experiences are in trying to confront this also through that kind of interdisciplinary lens.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, Isadora. I fully agree with Isadora. So it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time. And I think it's also very important to constantly think about this problem. So we will. There are other biases that come into play once you more analyze, once you more see the system, how it is performing. Of course, there are certain things that we kind of evaluated, targeted, like for example, when we composed the cohorts balancing females and males, we were kind of targeting this aspect. But then we also understood that could be bias which is coming potentially from the care provider, from the clinicians themselves, from the way the records are created. So I think that's essentially, it's a process which requires constant monitoring and thinking about the problem. What I also I think one of the key ideas of the project I'm participating on, which is an interdisciplinary project with clinicians, is to actually inform the clinicians on the bias in the system. That will essentially, together with some help, monitoring help or screening help, saying that, okay, this is potentially a person who would have anxiety, who has potential anxiety chance of certain level, will also inform clinician on the potential bias in this prediction and how this bias may be related to the data, maybe not, depending probably on the level of the expertise of the clinician and whatever the clinician can influence this decision process. That's, I think, my key points, which very much correspond to yours, Isadora. Thank you.
Right, and I think just to sort of zoom in to the community of research practice, I think more and more we're seeing that when we are scoping out research and we're mapping out what a research project should look like, when you're using data, when you're building AI to support research, what needs to be done increasingly is you need to think about how do I integrate multi-stakeholder communities into my research, right? Which is to say, when we're writing the grant proposals, we're thinking more and more about, patient and public involvement, right? If you're doing research in health, or more generally, right, involving members of the public to help support and co-design research in the sense of citizen science and more. And so I think that we're at a very interesting transition point where the research that's being done with AI and with data is seen as a kind of a science with and for society, which is this kind of definition of responsible AI, that we can never engage in science in a vacuum, that science is always not just a technical endeavor, but it's a socio-technical endeavor. So I guess with that in mind, I will ask a question to both of you, which is about research ethics and the standards that ethical standards that we might apply to research. So one thing that I think have all experienced this past year and a half is this rapid commercialization of generative AI. You mentioned ChatGPT, right? There's a whole kind of set of these large language models out there that are really becoming part of a student's experience of learning, researchers' experience of trying to cope with a lot of information and summarize information. So I guess my question to both of you is, how can we think of a sort of a generalized approach to standardizing ethics as it applies to research and AI, or what steps do we need to take in order to move in that direction? Maybe Isadora, you can answer first.
Sure, thank you. I think that's a really fundamental question. I have a couple thoughts to offer in relation to that. So first, on the question of developing kind of standardized ethical frameworks for doing this kind of research, and specifically for doing this kind of research in collaboration with partners, with communities, and so forth. I think one issue there is, every time we're talking about standardization, there's always the question of not neglecting context, specificity, diversity, and needs. Like, there is always some need for flexibility and understanding of the context also. So I think in my experience in this project, it's helpful to think about this in terms of kind of guiding principles, frameworks that could be like principles that could be shared, but that still have some built-in flexibility that allows for context and for integrating diverse experiences and perspectives. And in addition to this, I think most fields now have also pretty robust ethical standards and methods that are already pursued for securing informed consent, right? For making sure that participants are aware of the process and understand what's being asked of them and what the risks might be and so forth. So I think also that is an important part of the process. And I think, in relation to the collaborative aspect in particular, I think it's important, if you're a researcher, you're designing a project and you want to be participatory, it's also important to think about how can you engage in meaningful participation and collaboration that doesn't reproduce extractive patterns in AI labor that we've seen and so forth, but that really tries to take into consideration the time that you're going to be asking from the participants, what that might imply for them in terms of their own professional activities and other things that they engage in. So I think there is a risk, like in my discipline of development studies, historically we've seen a lot of participation that ends up being extractive, ends up being tokenistic. And I think we need to think about also how institutions can better support collaborations that are meaningful, well-resourced, and that allows us to compensate our partners for the time that they put into these projects.
What do you think, Jill?
Well, of course, I fully very much agree with Isadora, and I think that as academics, we're very much embedded into ethical standards and practices. So I'm myself a member of the ethical committee at the School of Electronic Engineering and Computer Science. And I think simply just to start with, by reporting and making this a part of the standard procedure to explicitly ask for ethics approval with respect to the not only usual methods that we used, but also with respect to the AI methods that we use, that could be probably already a very useful first step. And of course, probably will be also very much helpful, because of course I can understand that from the point of view of the ethics committee, it could be very difficult to assess the liability of those systems. There should probably be some reporting measures also describing how those system acts, how the system builds, and some reporting standards for those systems, so that they could be more easily assessed by a wider audience of researchers.
Right, and I think that the one interesting variable that we see increasingly across different research ethics committees is now really thinking about impact assessment, right? Years ago, doing an ethics review process was really just about the human subject side of it, right? Or increasingly then about the data protection side of it. But I think now, even to put papers in conferences, one needs to, in AI and in data-driven research, you increasingly have to reflectively anticipate how the choices that you're making in choosing a subject and approaching your methodology, how that might impact communities and individuals. And so it is a different story now than it was a decade ago even. So I have maybe a question that relates to your relationship to each other, actually, which is to say, we have on the panel really a social scientist, if you will, and a computer scientist. And in the past, there have been literally barriers of communication between the social sciences, which really work with a really messy set of data, if you will, and have to continually cope with, thinking about the complexities of social practices. And in that world, the making of good arguments, the way that you draw on vocabularies is very different from in computer sciences, where you have very distinctive qualitative languages, coding languages, and this is in a sense why some people would call it the hard sciences versus the so-called soft sciences. Now, one of the issues I think with AI and research that has been brought out so far is that we can't just say this is a technical affair, right? And we can't just say it's a social affair, obviously, because it's with a technology, so it's socio-technical. So I guess the question is, how can we get you two to start talking to each other more or better, where there isn't a prioritization of scientific language, hard science over the inferences from the social sciences? How can we start down the road of addressing that? Do you want to take it first, Julia?
Yes, thank you, Dave. Well, I think for me, what was when I first started to work on the interdisciplinary project, and I think what's very important is to really try to include as many interested parties, as many stakeholders as possible, and ask as many people from different disciplines involved in the problem, actually people who see the problem from another discipline, and also people who are actually, as for example in healthcare research, there is also patient perspective, and I have also been involved in initiatives and organizing workshop for actual users of NHS, for example, and try to listen to this perspective, try to understand this perspective. And then what I usually do myself, I always try to acquire this perspective. And further, when I do some further steps in my own research, I always try to consider those perspectives and then realign myself at certain point again with various stakeholders. And I think that this interdisciplinary collaboration enriched me enormously. I think that was probably one of the most important steps in my career, is to understand and try to comprehend how people from different disciplines, from different perspectives, see what we do and what is the actual importance of what we do in real life, even if it is academia, but something outside our narrow domain and our narrow field.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, that resonates with me as well. I think a good place to start is building conversations like this that brings people from different disciplines together to reflect or share what they're doing on those issues. I think the kinds of issues and questions that we ask also invite collaboration, especially like you said, if we think about AI as a social technical issue, right? And if we think about the kinds of applications that it's being put to use, like around social justice issues, around environmental concerns, and so on and so forth, like inevitably that is going to invite conversation and from people with different knowledge, different perspectives, different kind of value systems as well. And I think that can be really, really productive if we have a willingness to listen and a willingness to learn from one another. I also think that there is an aspect of this and having these kinds of conversations that has to do with, translating and kind of, bringing a sort of critical popular education to thinking about AI. The reason I'm saying this is because, before I started working on this project, I probably had a very similar understanding than other folks might have that, AI or an algorithm is some sort of magical device that's out there. We talked about this a bit before. And you don't really know how it works. You don't even realize that we have a lot of say over how it's designed and the kinds of tasks that it does, right? So I think, by amplifying these conversations, we also build criticality and allow for, broader conversations around this technology.
Well, we're just about to meeting the end point of the conversation, so I wanted to ask both of you for one more reflection, a short one. So the title of the dialogue is the promises of AI, right, for the public good, using AI and research for the public good. So what do you think, if you could have a crystal ball, what do you think the greatest promise is from your perspective of using AI for the public good in research?
If I, sure. Well, I mean, for obvious reasons that relate to the things I talked about, I'm really interested in research that is focusing on participatory AI and how we can engage communities and different kinds of groups in a very meaningful way. There's also really interesting work on reparative algorithms that try to use AI to achieve social justice goals or to redress historical harms. We have folks in our team like Won-Young Soo, who has been doing excellent work on that, on housing issues, for example, housing inequality. And I guess I also do research on sustainable finance and impact investing and issues related to sustainable development. So I'm really interested in how AI is being used to address the climate crisis or other kinds of environmental challenges that we have.
Well, for me, probably the most important thing is actually this ability to bring together research from different disciplines. I think that is something which kind of, again, made the biggest impact on me in the last couple of years, because I've started my research in computer science in something in the beginning of the years 2000, and it was always very much closed. We were always just doing our equations, our numbers, and with large language models, I think it became really connecting the dots and seeing what are the connections of learning about the actual society via doing our technical, more algorithmic work. And I think that's the biggest promise for me. It's very difficult to say now what will be the impact, how the things will evolve. Very difficult, but I think this is a very unique angle and unique opportunity to do interdisciplinary and collaborative research.
Yeah, I mean, to think of the promise of AI as demanding interdisciplinarity, I think that's a very positive thing. So, well, thank you both. And I'll also just thank our audience for tuning in the middle of the day on a Thursday. And one final thank you to the really, really amazing team at Queen Mary in events and comms who have really worked hard behind the scenes to get this going. So thank you so much for joining us.